Hello, we are back again with the Global History Laboratory Study Circle, and today we are going to discuss Achille Mbembe's On the Postcolony, the 2001 English edition, and we are both discussing the introduction, Time on the Move, and then the first two chapters of Commandment and on Private Indirect Government. And today, those who will be present is me, I'm Holger Weiss.
And I'm Martin Kwazema.
Kaarle Wirta.
And I'm Patrik Hettula.
And I give the floor to Kaarle, who will do a short introduction to our theme today.
Thank you, Holger. Thank you, everyone. I was really happy to be invited by the Åbo Akademi Global History Laboratory crew today for give the short introduction on Achille Mbembe's book on the Postcolony. Mainly because of two reasons. Firstly, for its recognized importance for a broad scholarly audience, and especially within social sciences and humanities. Second, because the book was, actually with James Ferguson's Global Shadows, Africa in the New Liberal World Order, the most eye-opening books that I've ever read, and especially while doing my Erasmus exchange at the University of Leipzig in 2011, these books became really familiar to me. I still remember it quite vividly, how I opened up the book for the first time and started reading it and at the university library, and it was the book that actually forced me to sit very long hours making notes, having copious amounts of coffee, because it really started to play with my head. The book on the Postcolony developed ideas in my head, questions about history and remarks about how I as a historian have approached African history, European presence in African history, but also on a more abstract level about power relations and questions about subjectivity and domination. Not only in a colonial context, but also more in a general present context. Therefore, I'm actually very happy to return to this book after almost 7 years later, and with a master's and almost a PhD later, and to finally revise those previous thoughts and perhaps even see how my thoughts have been developing around the book for the past years. So today, we will focus on the author Achille Mbembe, a Cameroonian public intellectual with a broad academic background, and his renowned book on the Postcolony. The book actually came first out in French in 2000 and soon followed up by an English translation, which we are using today, which I have myself also read back in 2011. The second edition of the book came in 2015, if I'm not mistaken. The book consists of a collection of 6 essays. The first 2 chapters, which we will deal today with, are more of an economic and historical character, whereas the remaining chapters are more philosophical, psychoanalytical, and literature-oriented. And as Holger already mentioned, we will focus on the chapters Commandment and Private and Indirect Government. But before opening the floor for discussion, I would like to offer a very brief idea of the 2 chapters and perhaps even give some glimpses of the general ideas of the book. Basically, Mbembe wants to write about Africa using examples from social theory and history without a certain colonial imperial paradigm. According to Mbembe's own view, Africa is not predestined. It is rather full of surprises. It is about temporality of the past, present, but also the future. It has surprises and is not aimed to speak for anyone particular. It is chaotic and volatile, but at the same time it wants to demonstrate the paradigms of why Western theories are not generally applicable in terms of modernizations and globalization in the context of Africa. The first 2 chapters have a quite heavy focus on transitions from colonial rule to post-colonial rule, and looking especially at the role of violence in creation of dominance and commandment. When I think about the book, especially the 2 chapters, they make me immediately think about 2 things. First, how does Mbembe's philosophy translate into a broad, perhaps even a global reading of power relations? Of course, the context and the specialities of what Mbembe discusses in his book are tailored for the African continent, but I can't help myself to start to think about power relations in a more general context, both in history but also in present, and how different forms of domination and power manifests itself. The second thing that I think about when I read Mbembe is about the colonial rule, authority or sovereignty, if you like, as a space. It's a rather heterogeneous space, full of violence, arbitrariness, and ad hoc solutions, but also banality. It's more like a set of processes and entangled systems which create locally different attributes through the colonizing systems. It differs from the arrival of the Europeans to the becoming of independent states, and even in the post-colonial period. When reading sub-Saharan African colonial history and spicing it up with works by, for example, François Bayard, Achille Mbembe, and Frans Fanon, but also other authors from the spatial turn, it becomes actually more clear that the colonialism was at the same time planned and developed space as it was improvised and a system of constant change in this type of particular space. This would also result in my main criticisms to Mbembe's work. It's sometimes quite generalizing. There are some factual errors also related to the early period of European colonization, the background of African middlemen as one example given. But these errors are not too heavy, in my opinion. But they merely show that Mbembe did not emphasize the pre-colonial period in the same way as he did for the later processes. The overall reception has been very positive from the get-go. Scholars from different fields within the political sciences and humanities have praised the book for its multiple, simultaneous perspectives and honest and thought-provoking argumentation. But it has also been criticized. Among the milder critique has been his moderate referencing to other scholars, especially for his Afro-pessimism has taken a lot of place. Mbembe has also been criticized for being too abstract and ambiguous in his theories, to which I partly agree. In my opinion, there are some issues related to the overly complicated language, which gives an impression that when the theory does not fully apply or it becomes insecure, the text becomes more complex. In its own way, it's an academic, within quotation marks, method of violence. It requires quite a lot from the reader. Another issue, in my opinion, is time. The lack of any political dates or categorizations of time except for colonial and post-colonial periods make it difficult to assess where are the shifting moments of the historical processes which he's talking about. The book offers a geographical space of Africa, but multiple overlapping times, or even better processes of time, which can be applied to the whole space. But because of the delocalized character, it is occasionally rather difficult to grasp where and in which segments of space did this complex overlapping multiple heterogeneous processes of commandment, governance, through violence take place. After this short introduction, I would like to invite the rest of the reading circle to the discussion by asking how they experienced the book by Mbembe and how global are the arguments of domination, subjection, agency, commandment, and post-colonialism, especially in taking consider the special platform of the Global History Laboratory, which we are dealing here with today. If we use that as a starting point, I think we will find a good discussion of topics.
Yes. Great introduction to our work today on Mbembe's really dense work, as I would agree. And of most interest to me has been his description on the influence of colonialism on African on the geographical expression of the African nations today. And being an African, raised, born, and trained over there in Africa, I see a lot of similarities with his description of the colonial period with that of the post-colonial periods. I mean, like, especially when I think about the three forms of violence he speaks about, the founding violence, the civilizing violence, and the third one which tends to maintain the geography that has actually been established by violence. And then I compare that with the inception of the same repetition, the same series in the post-colonial era of Africa, especially the post-independent states. And of very interesting example to me is the case of Ghana, which I'm working on personally, and the series of military coups which erupted after the ousted of Kwame Nkrumah in '66. And I see the same notion, I see the same pattern of this colonial system of establishing power and government in a similar fashion. And it tends to highlight to me the kind of like repetition, so to speak, of these ways of establishing power on the areas, on the geographical areas of the African nations, and to me that's very interesting because then it tends to highlight to me what really was the difference, so to speak, in the colonial and the post-colonial times. I see a lot of repetitions in the ways and manners of establishing this power, and I also see a courage of the dominance of the colonial thought, so to speak, in the sense that the colonialist absent still envisages the presence of the colonial system in the colony, in the post-colony, and it's really a very interesting perspective for me to really start this argument, and so I think I would really start on that and expand on that further later.
Mbembe is, of course, always thought-provoking, and I mean, you have to read his text time over and over again, and you find new kind of entrances. I think I read Mbembe also some 15 years ago for the first time, or was it 20 years ago? It cannot be 20 years because it came out 2001. In any case, you kind of posed a question about why we're reading this book now at the Global History Lab, and how we kind of still would say that it is an important work also when we speak about theoretical approaches to the global and so on. And in a sense, I think that Mbembe was not aware when he, on page 9, made this kind of statement, which kind of is a very interesting opening, which he does develop, but one could argue that here one could go even much more further when I quote, "The central assumption that guides what follows is that the peculiar historicity of African societies, their own raison d'être, their relation to solely themselves, are rooted in a multiplicity of times, trajectories, and rationalities that, although particular and sometimes local, cannot be conceptualized outside the world that is, so to speak, globalized." So we do have kind of this tension that he already kind of identifies, which we now speaking from, if you want to, after the spatial turn, after the kind of push into a perspective of the global in the local, of the global in whatever context, there I see is one very interesting opening that one can discuss. I do also think that kind of in the chapters that follows, I mean, Mbembe makes later on, and we maybe come back to that, because when you, Martins, kind of noted the carryover of colonial structures, in a sense colonial violence, these three forms of violence into the post-colonial independent African state, what I see kind of, and this of course highly interesting to see what you have, in a sense, the colonial government, or the colonial state, if you so want, is taken over by Africans at independence. But the colonial structures are not changed. And in particular, this means that what you have as the colonial army, which was not there to expand territory, but to keep the colonial peace, kind of this rationale d'etre for the army was then carried over to the independent states of in Africa, for the army neither to conquer but to keep inner peace. And this kind of, what I see then is a kind of repetition time and time again when the military says, okay, the politicians have failed because we have unstable political and economic conditions. We have to go in and guarantee the peace of society and so on, which kind of is in that sense, if you want to say so, a colonial mentality of the independent African armies nowadays. Now, of course, we could raise a question and say that, okay, has the mentality of the African armies changed since, let's say, the new way of democratization in African countries since the 1990s or so? I mean, many of the armies military rulers that were in power went back to the barracks and seemed to be kind of stay in the barracks so far. But this would be an interesting kind of point to discuss, for example, with Mbembe, what he sees about this later development. Another point is, which I think is much more problematic, Mbembe touches upon this question, is the question of the predatory state. Because he discusses pre-colonial African political entities and identify some of them as being predatory. And this, in a sense, is carried over. In a sense, we can discuss the colonial state. Is it a predatory state or not? But we do have many examples of pre-colonial African political entities, be they empires, be they state kingdoms, whatever you want to call them, that are kind of their economic foundation rests upon getting as much out of those over whom they rule. But it's not a question about ruling for them, but ruling out of them, extracting and living out of them. And this is kind of where we can discuss questions of whether this is a development due to external influences, forces. We would speak about the slave gun trade cycle during the transatlantic slave trade. But we have also kind of developments in societies where we have to discuss the influence, the direct or indirect influence of the transatlantic slave trade up on political structures in societies in the hinterland. Let's say in northern Nigeria, where you had the so-called Southern Mossi kingdoms of Dagbon, Mampurugu, Nanun, and Wa, which were by all definition predatory states, where the aristocracy and princes lived off the land, and we have slave trade, we have slave raiding and so on, but which kind of more was focused on feeding to the Ashanti Empire slaves and not directly to the Atlantic. So I think here that would be one question where kind of I would critically engage with Mbembe, more of saying, okay, yes, when focusing on the colonial legacies and the colonial structure, but the question of carried over pre-colonial structures in colonial systems of domination is a very kind of problematic question, to my understanding.
My reading of these two first chapters was based most on the early statements that Mbembe stated in pointing out how Africa has been in a way fabricated in scientific literature, and also how Africa has been usually portrayed as the other or as nothing, or in a negative sense, the subject of something that is being compared to Africa, but Africa being in the negative sense. What strikes me from this book and from your excellent introduction, Kaarle, is that I think that there is some kind of a crisis that is written inside this kind of introduction, a crisis of being or a crisis of spaces. They are not uttered in terminology that we might be used to from European scientific text, but I think that is purposely written in Achille's own words, where he wants to take a stand and leave Europe for European questions to be answered by European knowledge and the written knowledge that we have. Whereas I saw that because he discusses a lot of a crisis of being, a crisis of connections to the land, to the laws, to dominant powers, violence being in focus, where I saw that what this book is, at least in the first chapters, is building up the background of his arguments, which are written for his present audience. That's what I imagine, at least. And what I see is that there is some kind of a crisis also of the individual and the collective and the community and what that stands for, where he elaborates in discussions about the subject and about the different powers in play. And he discusses also about multiplicity of times and spaces, and this he calls them different durées. That you also pointed out that there isn't a really clear end, and the transition period is a durée in itself and passes over certain aspects, and you could even maybe discuss about a continuation of colonial times. What I'm interested in seeing in this discussion with you is that if his arguments, in a way, which isn't his alone. I think that he wants to be recognized as somebody as Frans Fanon and authors that are writing for a quite general, a general understanding of Africa or the colonial situation, and they don't want to be too specific because they want their theories to be quite general in themselves. But what I'm thinking is that he needs Africa to develop a new language, a new set of terminology to discuss the present and also discuss the past. A question to Martins would be maybe what would that language be for the future? But it's kind of a scientific African language that could be used, and could the Global History Lab, when we're discussing also Africa and colonial, post-colonial times, could we use the terminology and the knowledge that we have, or is that a continuation of the European, the Western terminology and language that really doesn't help to explain the present, the past, and the future situation in Africa? And this is a question coming from that I don't really have an answer to that myself.
Of course, not a specialist on developing own languages, but actually, Patrik, I think you said something quite relevant here about the idea of leaving the European languages. Although Mbembe is basing his arguments or using a lot of the Western philosophers or European philosophers as his reference point or the points he criticizes, which is fine. So he's probably still himself as well developing the sort of African language or how you quite well described it. That made me think about actually, because I'm still pondering upon the question, how global is this phenomenon actually? Is it necessary that it's contained in the space of Africa? Because when these similar type of dominant subject agency relations are seen in many contexts, not only in Africa, but I was thinking also even in Northern Europe. I was not an expert at all at the topic, but thinking about the Nordic states and their relationships with the Sami people, for example, as a short example of similar type of issues being still today discussed. What is the Sami voice in the media, in the debates, in public films and that sort of things? And this is, I think you're absolutely right, that the audience of Mbembe he's a public intellectual. He wants to provoke. He wants to add something to the discussion. And what I was thinking about is that when we are doing global history, is it the global history with the European voice? Is it global history with an African voice? Is it global history with maybe an East Asian voice? Or is there a global voice for global history? And this makes me think about also global sort of hierarchies within global history. So what Mbembe does really well is that he actually forces you, and it becomes, I think, even clearer in the subsequent chapters, where he actually uses examples of how does the post-colonial sort of domination manifest itself. And you can clearly see this is not only applicable in Africa, but everywhere where there is like these relationships of domination. And this is what made me also think about the role when we read a book like this as historians, and we would like to introduce a more sort of, I don't know if objective is anything we can ever achieve as historians, but at least aiming for as an objective and as a neutral standpoint as possible. And this has made me think about, actually, Mbembe forced me, I just realized it, he really forced me to think about hierarchies within what type of history we are writing, what we are basing our arguments on. And I think in that sense, the question is very good.
You kind of open the space for developing new ideas, and on one hand, what I think, I mean, Mbembe starts with this kind of very negative statement, which of course it is also made by others, this kind of the close negative notion of both when we speak of color, black being negative from a European white perspective, Africa being connected with darkness, brutality, and all this kind of stuff. And that's what he wants to break out from. And he wants to kind of stand back and find an inner voice, a kind of place, African voices, on equal terms. What I think is from a global historical perspective important is that when we take the concept of the Postcolony or the concept of colonialism or the colonial situation, that's the global concept. And we can go to Asia, we can go to Africa, we can go to Europe, we can go to North America, South America, anywhere and so on. But what I think is as important is the question of agency. Because if we, and this is a kind of Afro-pessimistic kind of genre paradigm, is that we can blame everything on the colonial situation. We can blame everything on the transatlantic slave trade and so on. We have a long array of how we can explain why the present state of African societies is what it is. But what I think becomes problematic then is that although you come from a critical Marxian or developmentalist or whatever and so on perspective, is that you take away the possibility of local or African or whatever colored agency. You kind of assume or make this a very kind of monolithic way of the colonial situation is in a sense gives no room for anybody else. But or even Mbembe says that they are. I mean, it is not that simple. And what I would kind of much more highlight is that if you want to break this negative idea of a kind of pessimistic or belittling or putting Africans in the periphery and saying that they're not capable of doing anything and so on, is to say that we have to turn around and we have to kind of find African agency, be it negative, be it positive, whatever and so on, but to say that right, okay, yes, the transatlantic slave trade did exist, the colonial situation did exist, the post-colonial situation does exist, but how are people dealing with this? Mbembe gives a hint to subaltern studies and giving the subaltern a voice, but I think it's much more needed to kind of bring out the various way of how on various levels, and now I bring in again Jessop and the TSP framework, on various levels of how people were coping, let's say, with the colonial state and the colonial situation, because we all know, if we say that the colonial state, via its three ways of using violence, was capable of controlling, that might be so on a very kind of top-level scale, but when we go down on various scales below, down to a village level, we might question how, let's say, in the Gold Coast or the northern territories of the Gold Coast, where you had, or northern Nigeria or other places, where you had a certain amount, a limited amount of white colonial administrators and a limited amount of soldiers, how you could control the area, the territory. And of course, from an abstract, more top level, it is possible. You create maps, and in this way, you start to control the territory. But when it goes down on a regional and then local level, from the macro to the meso to the micro level, it becomes much more kind of questionable. And where you can see much more these how local ways of both coping and doing, not doing, fooling the Europeans. I mean, if you read different stories about the colonial experience. Let's say the great Malian novelist, Muslim scholar Hampateba and his kind of childhood memories and so on, or Wole Soyinka's text about his childhood and so on. It is very much different perspective about how you kind of, you were playing around with the colonial authorities, with the those who thought that they were controlling and dominating. But by the end of the day, the question comes, did they or did they not? This, of course, is then a similar problem for the post-colonial state. Because again, if these structures were set in place to control, but de facto not controlling on a meso and micro level, then this becomes a problem for the post-colonial state, which takes over these structures. So what you have is a kind of, you have a very, what I would call a torso state, a torso political entity that is established through colonial domination and colonial conquest, but which kind of never becomes a full-fledged state, because that's not the whole idea, which is then taken over by those who stand in the forefront for move towards independence and national sovereignty and so on. And this, of course, is a tragedy that which I would say that which has to be included. That one problem of colonial domination in Africa is that it was kind of defunct in a sense right from the beginning, because it was not about to establish a colony.
I think it's very interesting, especially when, like Patrik, you spoke about the future and finding an African voice. I think it's it gives me a very fantastic perspective, because I remember the first time I spoke to Holger and he told me how Fanon's text could actually aid my understanding for the thinking about the future of the African space and all of these arguments. And it was very difficult for me. But now I'm beginning to understand, especially like you spoke about the global perspective. And when I think about this whole carrying over of the colonial system, I read from Basil Davidson in 1240 or thereabout, when we see the collapse of the ancient Ghana Empire and then the taking over by it's morphing into the Songhai Empire, thereabout in ancient African history. And then trying to understand or this whole concept of finding the African voice. Because what I see when I read history is, especially as a futurist, is I see we tend to focus a lot, probably the European colonization of Africa seems to have been dominant, but there's a lot of discussion that needs to also be spoken about the Arab colonization of Africa, the Arab conquests, and like if we remember most of the great works of ancient African history, which we know today have actually been written by Arab scholars and Muslim scholars, so to speak, and so. Yeah. And so it's really interesting to try to understand how further we have to go backwards in order to tend to find this African voice towards to finding probably the genuine African language to understand or speak about the philosophy of Africa and all that. And when Mbembe also speaks about the indigenization of the state, when the state tends to be indigenized, what I hear from that is this whole entrance into the colonial system, but then a delving back into a pre-colonial state of the colonial system when the state becomes indigenized. And when I think about Nigeria, for example, I see this over and over again. When Nigeria had the civil war in '67, we saw Nigeria came into independence in 1960, and then the state became indigenous. I mean, the colonial system became indigenized into what we would call the Nigerian state, which caused internal fractions and led to a civil war. And then the stabilization of that whole situation ended up becoming an indigenization of the colonial system, which we also call the nation state. And so trying to understand that, especially from the perspective of global history, it strikes me a lot on how far do we have to go, especially in terms of discussion on Africa. How far do we have to go to escape the entire colonial discussion, though the salient ones, especially from the past? How far do we have to go, jump over those to find the original lines of arguments to start thinking about global history, especially for the African context? Because also when I also read about this whole, I have a blog where I also write about this, and I started writing and studying about this ancient city called the Yoruba. The Yoruba is a Nigerian language. It's one of the Nigerian languages, but at a point in time, it was actually the country. It was the name of the region of the western part of the Niger Valley. It was the country. And then in this Yoruba nation, we also see these factions, these whole systems of dominance and these whole structures and all that. And even from the original so to speak, the original context of the African entity in itself before probably the Muslim or the Arab conquest and then transatlantic slave trade, we see a similarity of certain structures and systems. So it strikes me when you ask the question on whose language of globality should we talk about or in when we think about how this global history has impacted most of the parts of the world. And I think this is just Africa, but I'm sure there are these similarities, in several areas of the world, and how to systematically address the discussions, going beyond just probably the transatlantic slave trade, but finding the core of the theoretical perspective of how to discuss about the globality in all of this. So I think that's one area. Mbembe's book helps me, it tends to help me disrupt the mental models I have when it comes to talking about colonial sovereignty and all that, and then trying to get to the core of how to really discuss this entity called Africa. Yeah.
Yes, very interesting discussions so far. I think that also Mbembe has argued is that there is a problem of what he would maybe call the black burden, or a problem of emulating the Western or the white, and which is also one of his arguments in the beginning of the book, that in a way a shame of the African past, the African history that is. One might be also recognized here is that there's been a sort of a reconstructing a African history, which bases quite a lot on a quite traditional way of looking at empires, a continuation of people, as you were speaking of the ancient Ghana Empire, and there's been a push towards also reconstructing and trying to piece together that kind of a traditional history for Africa, different regions. But coming back to the discussion of the global language or the global history perspective that we can use, which is hierarchical in itself, there are different debates, of course. But what I think that in Global History Lab, what we are working with is the macro, meso, micro point of views that also Holger here open up, the stories that can be found in localities where this kind of more abstract, theoretical, the dominant structures don't apply, because you have all of these, which also Mbembe is talking about, this complicated reality, which in much of science, when theorized, becomes quite streamlined. The case of the native or the person without any kind of other sense than the present, which was one of his examples, the native as a child, an animal who lives by instincts and stuff like that, which then it completely is disorienting in a way when you go then and look at these cases in archives that tell you about situations that don't really comply with the general view of the colonial state or the post-colonial state. But I think that there's been, of course, a big move in this kind of a sense of being, a sense of pride of being African, and a sense of not only reconstructing the Africa, but in a way deconstructing the Africa. I think that there's been this kind of push towards a tabula rasa, where something new for the present is going to take place. But as global historians, the cases that we've been working with imply that there are these more overhanging narratives that can be told from using the microscope and then the telescope. This kind of combination of explaining structures, but pointing out the real experienced life, which we've also become acquainted with from spatial theories, where you have lived experience reality, which is very important in Mbembe's reasoning, the body is quite central to his arguments. The body as the vehicle which moves and reacts and has agency or doesn't have agency, but this kind of relationship constantly in multiplicical timelines, narratives, and spaces.
That's true, and I want to further kind of make the picture more complex, because what I kind of have sympathy with, but I always have problems with, is this kind of what tends to be a Pan-African narrative, that you kind of try to create a unified narrative, which, of course, the idea is that there's something which every African can, due to his or her color, due to his or her African background, so combines them all. And especially when we speak about the colonial condition and the kind of simultaneous various spaces that you have, and especially then if you go back to the late pre-colonial period and move on to the post-colonial period, I kind of have problems in making it too a generalized narrative, in a sense that we see a certain trajectory happening. Because when we can speak about the violent colonial violence and the violent tradition of colonialism, and we can easily point to various narratives that we find on the African continent, starting with Leopold's Congo Free State, with the suppression of the Maji uprising in German Eastern Africa, or with the suppression and genocide against the Herero and Nama people in German Southwest Africa, and so on. But at the same time, we have a totally different narrative when we speak about, let's say, Tete Koshi and the introduction of cocoa farming on the Gold Coast, which happens at the same time. So we can go on with this kind of, make the whole picture and the whole colonial situation and the experience of colonial violence much more problematic, because what seems to be the grand narrative, then, and we go on a meso or micro level, does not apply. So, but for me, kind of this idea of an African story, an African continent, and then of course always the question, is Northern Africa included in this narrative or not? What comes to me always is this kind of, usually when we speak about the British colonial experience, is that you would make a clear distinction between settler colonies and the whole kind of development that happened there, let's say in Kenya, Southern Rhodesia, or South Africa, of course, versus the trade colonies. We don't have settler colonies in West Africa, and British West Africa has a total kind of different experience with the colonial state than the Eastern or Southern African British colonies had, for example, and those people who live there. And a good example is that usually when we speak about British rule, we think about indirect rule, which was not applied in all colonies, of course, and its basic text by Lord Lugard. The book is Dual Mandate or Indirect Rule, an introduction to indirect rule from 1922. But there's an older text which is very, very interesting and very seldomly kind of used of how indirect rule actually was functioning. And I'm thinking of Charles Lindsay Temple's book, Native Races and Their Rulers, because in fact it was Temple who in northern Nigeria introduced and kind of worked and established indirect rule. And that book is a fascinating kind of inside story about that the emirs were doing whatever they wanted. The British residents, the colonial officers, and so would give an order, but then the emirs would say that, sorry, all cattle are dead, no taxes. And then the residents would, but they are cattle, yep, they're dead. So this kind of, depending on what sources you're using, you get a kind of interesting, different stories out of the whole.
But I would like to end, continue reflecting upon what Holger was talking about in the previous comment, but also in the comment before about the torso states and the idea of what type of archives we're working with, what we are looking at. And I was thinking about Paul Nugent's book, about the smuggler movements between the Ghana to Gabon border, and that made me actually realize that in that case, what he has found in the archives is that in the post-colonial states, or in the colonial and post-colonial state, the Mbembe idea doesn't actually work, because that tells a very different story. It does have a clear connection to the book on the post-colony, and in one of the subsequent chapters after 1 and 2, where Mbembe is talking about how power manifests itself also at border controls, at border patrols, how they use these symbols and how they violence and assault people and come up with all kinds of excuses to give fines and so on and whatnot. But at the same time, on the local, if you go to below meso, to the really the grassroots level, actually these people manage to also to play the same game. They participate in a, if anything, then the post-colony is a game in this sense, that they manage to take advantage of these absolutely arbitrary borders and make a living out of it, and sort of as these smaller merchants, one could even call entrepreneurs if one takes that standpoint. But the point here is that Mbembe helps us to think. He helps us to see the manifestations. You can see it. He makes them visible. The symbolisms are there, but the agency is not passive. And this made me think about perhaps a good companion to this book would then be James C. Scott's book. And I was thinking about like sort of everyday resistance. Action creates counteraction and resistance. And it does not always manifest in large forms, but it does. They always play by the rules, and we see this already in the colonial period very clearly, especially in my area of specialty, which is the 17th century Western African trade. You see that both the indigenous merchants or merchant princes and with their European collaborators, they start to play against the monopoly of the trading companies, which completely flips the story the other way around. In the focus is not anymore what the board of directors says in Europe about how to conduct trade and how to build a trade, but actually the other way around. It becomes this collaboration between the local merchant networks, whether they are Europeans and non-Europeans, which gives, in my view, a very different perspective what Mbembe is offering here. But not say that Mbembe's work is not influential. The opposite, actually, it really helps us to think. But it actually, because it emphasizes so much the generality of complexity, multiplicity, arbitrariness, ad hocness, all that makes me actually to realize also the counter-reactions are a part of that world. And they are equally important. I think that is something that is valuable for us in this laboratory, is to actually think about not taking anything as one big process of predestined Africa, but actually to see the counter-reactions. It gives us hope to see also different ways of looking at the continent and space. And as a final conclusion then, if one would really want to focus on the topic, one can't, of course, get without reading Production of Space by Henri Lefebvre, because that book really helps to build the basic foundations of how this would work in a global perspective. And perhaps that would have something helpful for Mbembe to think about in the future as well, explicitly in the book. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. We are probably going to return to Achille Mbembe and also this book in a later occasion. But thank you today, everybody.
Yes.